Shabbat Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. This is the second week of the counting of the Omer. And of course, we have experienced this week a contractive energy, an implosion or a closing in on itself. And it's been relatively uncomfortable. It is definitely the wilderness season. You can feel the hungers flaring, right? So I want to say just briefly, and it'll tie into today's message in a sort of way, but I want to just remind you all that that contractive energy and those hungers are part of the light. And what I mean by that is that they were created as part of the process of the light. They are a feminine or receiving principle. They are a receptacle of energy. That's all a hunger is. And therefore, a hunger is not wicked. And a hunger is not evil. And a hunger is not dark. Now, when we start to get into the actual dynamics of human interaction, hungers can be distorted into vices, if you will. They can be distorted into feelings of a lack of control or experiencing someone else out of control. I propose to you that self-control comes from the contractive energy of this week. Well, one of the things we need to get into in this is the masculine and feminine principle, because I'm about to show you something very profound that is going to change your heart and your mind concerning how you view yourself in light of your stewardships, okay? So let's say that we start with a simple sense of reductionism, okay? So in terms of reductionism, we have two very important elements. The first is that you are an entropic energy. You are actually moving from hot to cold, and you're moving from being very expansive and energetic to settling and coming into order. Now, when scientists look at this, they understand that that means that that heat engine is eventually going to wear out and it is going to stop working. Now, when we talk about trisomes, we start to get into the idea that they actually dictate how many times a cell can reproduce. And at this point in time, it is only allowed for a cell to reproduce 26 times. Now, if you were to take a growth formula that had like a steady increase of doubling, or what we call octaving, then you would figure out that the truth is that the cell just splits in two. And then it splits in two again, and then it splits in two again, and it's allowed to do that 26 times. But each cell then does the same thing. So the offspring from the cell then ends up being a new cell, and that new cell has the ability to split 26 times. Well, what's interesting is that starts out as a upward curve and then begins to decline as more and more cells hit their limit. Okay? Now, the way that I want you to think about this is in terms of the exciting moments of hungers, right? In fact, let me go ahead and draw this on the board. I think that's going to be a better way for me to illustrate it than to draw it in the air with my hands. So we'll go to the board real quick. I think I'm going to just stick with the colors I have going on. And we're going to start with the presentation of hunger being this very strong build up, okay, And then as there's a satisfying, let's go ahead and switch colors here. There's a plateau point, and there's a reduction. Actually, let's do that in an even different color. So here's the plateau point. And then as the reduction begins to occur here in the decline, so, and actually, this is actually faster than this. Okay. So we could basically say then that this is actually the diagram of hunger. Okay. And in terms of that, you can't think of it in terms of food. You need to think of it in terms of satiety. So, what is satiety? Hunger is looking for satiety. Okay? And satiety is the satisfaction of hunger. So, anytime that we have desire, right? Desire, I need to spell that correctly. Desire, it is actually a lack of satisfaction. Okay? A lack of satisfaction. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we are working with a model of the wilderness season, we need to understand that it says here, let me go ahead and show you this again in Deuteronomy chapter 28. We'll navigate there for you here for a second. Deuteronomy, I'm sorry, not 28, chapter 8, verse 3. Okay, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, we have that's chapter 3. Having a hard time getting to 8 today. Okay, there we go. Chapter 8, verse 3 says, He humbled you by letting you go hungry. Then he gave you manna to eat, which you and your ancestors had not known, so that you might learn that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. Okay, so from that perspective, then we understand that hunger is a desire to be satisfied, or hunger is a lack of satisfaction. Hunger then results in, satisfaction is actually the result of hunger being reduced. So hunger builds and builds and builds and builds, and then hunger begins to be satisfied and plateaus, and then drastically drops off as satisfaction occurs. So this is the life of desire. Now, the reason why this is important is because this line right here is the beginning of satisfaction. The death of hunger is here. Okay? The life of hunger is here. Now, when we are looking at the concept of desire, we need to understand desire is not sin. It is not impure. Okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because we're going to get into some understandings today that require you to really understand hunger and satiety. Now, I said at the beginning of this thing that it would somewhat tie in because we have to get into something a lot deeper. But the first thing I want you to understand is how desire works. Okay? It slowly builds. And what you need to know, this is going to be an important fact, is this is actually our conscience being awakened, our conscience being awakened, okay? And the way I would put that to you is that there is an element of moral conservancy, okay? Moral conservancy that is awakened. So what a hunger does is lets you know that there's a deficit, but it builds on itself. I want you to think about this. You skip breakfast, you're probably okay. You skip lunch, about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, you start to get a little bit edgy, right? By the time you get home and it's time to eat dinner, you're almost ravenous. Why skipping breakfast wasn't all that big a deal was the same reason why skipping lunch actually was a big deal. And that is that hunger increases over time. Now, most people, when they get hungry for food, they will go find food. In fact, there is a concept in the plant world that I believe is called phototropic and aquatropic. And the principle is that a plant who lacks very much intelligence, but really operates more off of vibrations and frequencies than anything else, actually can detect the greatest amount of light and water available and actually can grow towards that. And interestingly enough, has the ability to influence itself enough because it doesn't have muscles. It just has cellular makeups to actually turn towards the light. Now, it's interesting because when we think about that, that's the plant's food. And so if we were to reduce ourselves down to plant level intelligence, we would at least turn towards food. Okay? Now, as we're turning towards food, at that point in time, as we experience that desire and we experience that satiety, or I'm sorry, we don't experience that satiety, we experience an increase in that desire in the same way that a plant would actually move towards light by growing in a direction that appears to not be natural. And you get trees that actually turn 90 degrees and then go out because there's some sort of retaining wall or something, and the shadow never allows the tree to grow, so the tree moves itself. If we accept that level of reduction, then we start to get into the idea that a hunger or a desire actually will cause us to move. Okay? Now, the reason why that's important is because then we start to understand that hunger and desire is actually a form of attraction. And there are very specific things involved in attraction, but what I want you to think about is like kind, right? Attracts like kind. Now, in the ionic sphere of physics, opposites attract. But the biggest place where we see like kind attracting like kind is in the realm of species copulation. Okay. So the way that you want to start to think about this is that the natural order processes create a puzzle piece fit, if you will, connection to other like kinds. However, there is a natural dynamic of binary masculine and feminine. Okay. So the way I want you to think about this is, yes, our hungers are not wicked. They are actually part of a natural order process designed in order to keep us within the kind that we need. Now, what's interesting about this is we don't realize that that's the form of cravings in our hungers. We usually crave the thing that our body needs at that moment. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a healthy idea to consume it, but that our body needs it. Second is the principle that within that process, we accept that all hungers, okay? Because I'm not going to label it. I'm just going to say it's a lack of satisfaction. So I want you to think about the things that you are unsatisfied with, perhaps at the moment, or perhaps at certain times of the month, or at certain times of the year, or whenever, that you don't feel satisfaction. And then you'll understand your hunger. So if you're not satisfied with your job, that is a hunger. If you're not satisfied with your vehicle, that is a hunger. If you're not satisfied with your spouse, that is a hunger. Okay? And so when we accept the context of satiety, we need to understand the dynamic that hunger is not a respecter of persons. And what I mean by that is hunger does not contain emotional attachment. Hunger is not connected to the bonding chemicals or the empathy chemicals in your body, which means hunger, if it is unchecked and intensified, will supersede your rational thought. Now remember, I'm not talking about food, am I? I'm talking about every single last thing where satisfaction is a factor. And so the reason this is important is because then we will be able to understand the dynamic of purpose, and we will understand the dynamic of satisfaction within the dynamic of purpose. Because all we got to do is take this formula and attach a name to it. For example, instead of hunger, we can put lack of food, and satisfaction would be becoming full. We could put lust, and satisfaction would be a contentment with the climatic experience behind lust, right? And then in hunger, we would also connect the idea that hunger, it has a certain life to it, even though it's a contractive energy. Hunger is contractive. Your stomach is actually starting to contract, and those are the hunger pangs you experience. So when we are working with this as a dynamic structure or a formula, and not necessarily a label, then we can assign anything to it, assign satisfaction as the thing that we want, right? And then we can understand the life and dynamic and satisfaction and plateau and all the other stuff that goes into it, which results in the fatness that is required to develop the golden calf season, but also will play a huge role in coupling, okay? In coupling. Now, when I talk about coupling, I'm not necessarily talking about two humans, a binary masculine or male and a binary female coming together in copulation. I'm talking about any interaction between that which would satisfy and that which is a hunger, okay? Okay, so there is a reason why this is important, because remember, Paul says what? In fact, let's read it. I know that this is kind of redundant, but I'll just share with you that I'm never really actually preaching to your conscious self, because your conscious self is stubborn and stiff-necked and biased and emotionally attached to its beliefs. But your subconscious is very rational and actually understands how to process information. So I speak in symbols, I speak in colors, I speak in parables, and I speak in difficult things for your mind to understand, and then I repeat those difficult things over and over again so that your conscious mind gets bored with it and you actually retain it. Yes, neat little trick, right? Okay, so here's a redundancy. Here's something that has been repeated often, and we're going to go ahead and read it today out of the Christian Standard Bible. For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Since what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. This, my friends, is the Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below. Now, there are probably those who are scared to death because the first thing they see is the two moons and the full moon, and they know it's witchcraft, and at the bottom it says as above, so below. Well, guess what? They're borrowing our truth. Okay? Thank you. They are borrowing our truth, and the proof is in Rabbi Shaul or Paul's testimony here that everything which has been made actually tells us about his processes, right? It tells us about the intensification of all power in the universe stuffed into something perceivable that we have labeled through the German Teutonic language God. Okay. Now, when we're working with this thought process, now we understand that hungers then would play a role and satiety would play a role in explaining something about the intensification of all power in the universe. Okay, so that being said, then what we need to do is we need to start to determine if indeed there is a pattern present, and that pattern which is present is a context of something greater and more important. So when we are thinking about things, it is important that we think about Isaiah 45, I believe it is. Actually, you know what? I think it's actually 47. Let's see here. Let me go ahead and let's see. And beginning would be my search terms. Okay. So in the beginning is actually going to be Isaiah 46:10. That's right. Isaiah 46:10. That's where we need to be. All right. I'm going to head over there now. And thank you for the opportunity to be valuable and have to use a search engine to look up my scriptures like every other human being who studies the Bible. Okay. I declare the end from the beginning, from long ago, what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place and I will do all my will. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that whatever we see in the end is actually the beginning. Okay? And what I mean by that is the end game of everything that we determine to be true has to have its place in the beginning of what we would understand a beginning to be, which unfortunately in our finite minds we have to very foolishly assign to time and then try to prove that it is a very small deterministic amount of time. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to identify that there's actually a legitimacy in understanding the end from the beginning, right? In other words, the end actually shows us a map of what once was, okay? So now then we need to go to the end. And the end of the book for Protestant Christians, and I'm going to say for Protestant Christians, is the book of Revelation, and very specifically we're going to go to chapter 19, which consequently seems to be the completion of a series of purging events on the earth. And when we look in verse 7, it says, let us be glad and rejoice and give glory because the marriage supper of the Lamb has come and his bride has prepared herself. Okay, so we've talked a little bit last week about the preparation of the bride in the Passover season. So what we understand is that the preparation that was made in order for her to be recognizable as a eligible bride has occurred, and now the negotiations on how the bride will be bought is in its process right now in this season that we're in right now, in the counting of the Omer, in the wilderness season is the negotiations for the bride. An exposure of beauty and blemishes, blemishes to be beautified, and beauty to be intensified. Okay. So why would this be important? Well, there are two very strong elements that we need to pay attention to. The first is that at the end, there is a marriage between a feminine principle, the bride, and a masculine principle, of all things, the lamb. Okay? Now, if you guys need help understanding that we are not talking about something that is covered in wool and is sitting in a paddock full of poo and stinking to high heaven and having all kinds of weird stuff on its wool and being very, very annoying animal, and some woman in a wedding gown. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at your conscious mind cannot understand this verse. Your subconscious mind has to, because it's speaking in symbols, right? Why? Because the subconscious mind does not speak English. It speaks symbol. Meaning what? You can't understand this verse without some sort of explanation or some sort of rationalization beyond the literal, which is what these authors of these end time books like to do. They like to literalize the book of Revelation. And when I say the end, I will propose to you that there are actually more books. And I will propose to you that those books are probably just as prophetic as Revelation. But because we are dealing with Protestants, most likely in this in this YouTube channel, and because we're dealing most likely with evangelical dispensational Protestants, then we have to dispense with some doctrine, don't we? Well, in the meanwhile, we need to accept that the lamb, if it is to be connected to a bride, is a masculine principle. And if we accept that the lamb, A, has the one who is worthy to open the scroll, and B, has been slain from the foundations of the earth and therefore has activated the resurrection power from the foundations of the earth, and we accept that it died at Passover in time, then we accept that the retroactive effect of resurrection power, the retroactive effect of the light of the Messiah, the retroactive effect of the light of Passover goes out from that moment in time to all of eternity. Now, what's really important to understand is if that's true, then we understand that it is an expansive energy. However, we also accept that for some reason it's diminishing, and we learned that that's because of concealment. It's not diminishing because of resistance, because that's not possible. If you resist the light of Passover, then you must be one of the firstborn who needs to die, right? If you resist the light of Passover, then you need to accept that that is a condemnation, that is a curse, or that is a cutting off from your people. But if you accept the light of Passover, then you are demonstrating that it actually doesn't diminish, but that it's hidden. But that diminishing over time is the result of more and more increase of human conscious involvement instead of human subconscious involvement. Now, when we're working with the idea of conscious and subconscious, we need to understand that 95% of your faculties are ran by your subconscious. You don't make a conscious choice for your heartbeat. You don't make a conscious choice for your breathing. You don't make a conscious choice for your balancing. All those little tiny little itty bitty muscular adjustments in your feet that keep you standing, you don't have a choice over. You don't have the ability to activate. In fact, those who are experienced experts in balance actually had to gain muscle memory through their subconscious or repetition before they actually had the balance that they had. Now, some people are naturally born with just the correct shape of feet and the correct equilibrium to be able to balance well. But generally speaking, those who are experts in balance had to overcome their imbalance. Well, that doesn't actually diminish any in knowledge or understanding as we get deeper into this. However, it's important that we understand that the lamb is a masculine principle. We need to understand that therefore it's expansive. We need to understand that therefore it actually is willing to be benevolent to a fault, right? We need to accept and understand that it is steeped in mercy. And also, if we accept that Hod in the emanations of God, or humility in the emanations of God, is actually a contractive, expansive energy of chesed through the balancing. A balancing occurs, and that a result is that there is actually a masculine / feminine energy that is humble, right? And that humility is a very empty vessel prepared to take upon itself all of the service of humanity. And of course, we understand it to be Messiah ben Joseph, or the first coming of Messiah Yeshua. Now, it is very important to understand that if we accept that to be true, then we have to acknowledge then that the lamb in its expansive masculine humble existence is actually extremely powerful. And the bride, which is very contractive, receiving, not able to give, but instead only receive authority from her husband, receive provision, protection, and instruction from her husband. So it's interesting that if we were to go back to the garden, we would find an actual transference of authority. Now, you've heard me talk about this before back in 2023 when I spoke about how you elevate authority into a position, and if they are worthy of it according to the determinations of the universe and not you, then they will stand. But if not, they will be reduced, right? But we need to go a little bit deeper. So the first thing that I want to do is explain to you the contractive mistake and thought, and this was actually the revelation of this week, of parents. Okay? Because we need to understand that the personification of the intensification of all power in the universe is a father and a husband, a masculine principle, whereas we are quote unquote children and the bride. So we have this individual service, or this individual stewardship, or this individual purpose as sons, and I'll explain that word in a minute. And we have this corporate connection to the intensification of all power in the universe as a female receiver or bride. Now, when we adjust to the context of this, we start to get into the Hebrew. We know that the bride begins as very willful and ends as a vessel ready to receive, right? And that there's an actual bonding at some point. We need to talk about that today. So the first thing that we need to do then is we need to talk about the responsibility of the bride. Whoops, that's not where I want to go. That's where I want to go. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to draw this really neat thing right here. Okay. And so on this side of the, on the right side, or the place of honor, if you will, where the bride is sitting in the place of honor, we have the Hebrew word yachal. Okay. Yachal. And that is actually, interestingly enough, yachal is the Greek word dunamis. And the concept behind dunamis, we will tie into, let's see, and the best way to do this is to probably, let's say that we go with the word power, I think is our best word for this. But I want you to understand power, not in the sense of authority, but actual energetic ability. Okay. Like, say, the Avengers, a supernatural enhancement of a physical being. Okay. Power. And contextually, when we think about power, see, because, like, for example, let me say this. What I want to do real quick, I want to create a differentiation between the power I'm talking about in the word yakal, okay, and the power that I'm talking about in the sense of authority. The best way to do this then is to actually take you to Matthew chapter 28, okay, and we can look at verse 18. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18. It says, Jesus came near and said to them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Now, in some versions, I believe, in fact, let's just go ahead and do it this way. Let's do a scriptural comparison. Let's see, authority. There we go. King James Version, all power. So if you're a King Jimmy guy, then power is the word being used. Okay, but a majority of them actually do use the word authority. But for those King Jimmy people, power is used. In the Darby version, it is power. DBY right here. That's the Darby version. And then, of course, in the actual in the WEB, which is basically the really easy to read English version. And then, yeah, I think that's probably going to be it for, oh, well, here we go. Actually, the Amplified version, all authority or all power of absolute rule. I like the Amplified version sometimes. All power of absolute rule. So what do we understand? We understand that that power is actually the Greek word exousia. Exousia right here.
Strong's G, 1849. Exousia.
Okay.
Exousia.
But we know this to be power of choice, liberty of doing as one pleases. This is sovereignty. Okay. So exousia is sovereignty, but that's not the power we're talking about, right? So if I go in here and I say virtue, and I actually need to search for that in the King James Version, then immediately it takes us to immediately Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, right? That is the Hebrew word dunamis.
Strong's G, 1411. Dunamis.
Okay.
Yes.
And if we go into here, we'll find our Hebrew word yakal present in the, what is this, the Thayers? Yeah, in the Thayers, we will find yakal present. Let me see. It is probably down here more. Actually, it looks like we have to go back to the root dunamai. And then we should be able to get, yeah, there it is. You're right there, yakol. Yakol, which is to have power, as in the virtue, which is actually, and this is important, unexplainable by any other means except a New Age understanding of energy. It is very important for you to understand that the Christianity does not permit for a supernatural enhancement of humans. It does in the Bible, but then a majority of Christianity, including deterministic, I'm sorry, not deterministic, dispensationalist evangelical Christianity demands for the actual signs to have taken a rest, as it were. So actual miracles don't occur anymore, right? Now, if you ask the charismatics, they're going to demand that they do, right? And they're going to say that it's through the work of the Holy Spirit. Well, when we start getting into the systematic theology of the Holy Spirit, I can prove to you, just through the systematic theology of the Holy Spirit, that it is actually a standing wave, scalar, non-Hertzian, non-entropic energy. All right? But for this case of this argument, we're talking about something that was felt as it left, which means it's Hertzian, it's detectable. Now, that's important because that means that we need to understand that if you can feel it, then it is actually a frequency and a vibration. And so he felt a vibration go out of him. Well, that's what we're talking about here with the word Yakal. We're not talking about authority here, okay? Now, I want to get that clear because a lot of people think when I say that she is willful or disobedient or rebellious, that I'm actually activating the idea that she is actually utilizing this power inappropriately. It's important for you to understand all good things come down from the Father of light, so this is a use of the light. However, something very important has to occur, and that is that there is what we call a permutation of the lettering. Permutation of lettering. So let's move back over to the board and take a look at the permutation of the lettering. Permutation of lettering goes like this. The next level is actually a Kaf Yod Lamed, and literally means to be bound. And it actually can be a binding of the wrists or hands. Now, let me explain that a little bit. So the next step, so on this side we have the right hand side of the bridal composition is what this is called, bridal composition. The right hand side is actually the side of honor, the place of honor. The seat where the firstborn sits, the seat where that guest which you wish to honor sits. Okay? But where is she? She's sitting on the right side, which means she has been positioned in the right. Now, she's sitting in the position of honor. She has the power, but she does not have anything to govern that power. Now, in the Hebrew word keel, okay, keel, it is the idea of the hands being bound together as if they were tied, okay? So there's a binding or a limiting that is placed upon the bride. And that limiting for a moment reduces or removes her power. Okay? But then, as there is a movement towards the side of her being the bride, something interesting is happening. Watch now. She is moving, and once again, we're going to permutate again. And this time, the yod is going to move to the outside to the left. So we're going to still have the kaf, and then we're going to have the lamed, and then we're going to have the yod. So what has happened? The yod has moved from the right to the left. Okay? The yod has moved from the right to the left. And so in that importance, we have the mechanism of a dew moving from the place of honor to a very different place. Because what has happened now? This Kaf Lamed, the whole time, has stayed consistent, and the only thing that has actually moved is the yod. Now, in ancient pictographic Hebrew, the yod is actually the drawing of an arm getting ready to grasp something, and it means to work. Work or do, okay? But what you don't know is that the Kaf Lamed actually means tame for the yoke. Okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because what you need to know is that this final word actually means vessel. The word for cup in Hebrew, keli. Keli. In fact, let me go ahead and put the the pronunciations up here. So this is Yah Kal. This is Ki On. And this is Ke Li. Okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because what I want you to see is how the yod moves from the place of honor to putting the tame for the yoke at the place of honor. Now, there's a reason I want you to understand this, is that the evolution of the bride goes from one of having power to one of receiving something. And the revelation of the bride goes from producing her own light to actually being something that would receive in order to expand and create something new. Okay? So, looking back at our verse in Revelation where the bride has made herself ready, this is the process of the bride making herself ready. Where she goes from being positioned by the greater in the position of honor to positioning the greater into the position of honor. And she goes from becoming that which is honored to being willing to receive from that which is honored. Okay? Now, that is an act of humility and specifically of contraction. She's reducing her ego to become the vessel of reception. Now, there's a reason why we have this here, because that word keel doubles as the word prisoner. Because that is how she could potentially view herself within the binding, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So this binding that occurs that takes her from her willfulness, right, and her dunamis to this actually is the act of preparing to be the bride. Why? I will show you why. Because the next process in this evolution, I'm going to have to make some more room for myself here real quick. Hopefully I get everything, because sometimes I miss stuff. Now we're just going to make a little bit more room, because the next thing that occurs is that the yod actually transforms into something else. Okay? The yod transforms into Kaf Lamed Hey. So the yod becomes the Lamed Hey. Okay? Then what is a kalala? What is a kalala? A kalala or a kala, which is just a double lamed, and it's pronounced like this. Kala is a bride. So you see the transition here. The transition is actually a concept of going from a position of honor, which is absolutely a legitimate position for a bride, to someone bound and who will perceive themselves to be a prisoner, to realizing that they are a vessel designed around free will to receive from the bridegroom, and then she becomes the chala. The chala, okay? She becomes the chala. And if you think that there's a connection between the word challah, bread, and challah, bride, you are correct. Okay, so now it is important that we talk about what actually is going on in this process. Well, it's something very interesting because this is often, how many times in the past have we heard of a concept of a manual? Right? We have the Bible, which is basic instructions before leaving Earth, probably one of the most ridiculous acronyms I've ever heard of. But okay, we're going to take we're going to take a Greek word, biblios, which means a compendium of books. And then we're going to tweak it into the English, and then we're going to say that that is actually an acronym that is representative of some communication from the intensification of all power in the universe. I've never heard anything so ridiculous. However, that is a reference to a manual because why? We think we need instruction. Oh, this is going to get interesting. The truth be told is we don't need instruction. We don't need instruction because that which has been made has already given us instruction. For example, although there are variations and derelictions of what I'm about to say, there is no non-binary process in the species of animals, only humans. Humans are the only ones that have declared that there's a non-binary process. Humans are the only ones that declare that there is such thing as what we call a naturally born male who chooses to not be male, and we have a naturally born female who chooses not to be female. Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form trying to determine a judgment or sentiment about a person's lifestyle choice. I am talking about the idea that you, with your mind, can twist things, but the natural order processes still exist in their way. Now, there's anomalies, right? We have some who are born with an extreme overdose of certain hormones that should not be present in that gender in that strength, and therefore create a very different aspect or outlook on life, which can also result in reproductive problems. But generally speaking, when we look at the animal kingdom, the sustainability of an animal kingdom, for example, when we release wolves back into the wild, or we release this animal back into the wild as an endangered species that's now a protected species, and we are trying to reintroduce that species into their environment, we're not releasing one gender. We're releasing two. And the reason we are is because we want to create a sustainability. We want to create a sustainability of that species based upon a binary natural order process. Now, what I'm going to present to you today is that that actually is proof of something very powerful within the context of all that we have going on. What I mean by that is that when animals are released into the wild in order to repopulate a species, there is a trusting of a process, isn't there? There's a hope on the part of the human beings who are involved in that protective species that they would repopulate and they would propagate, right? And so the premise is that in that repopulation, there is a hope that they contain all all the things needed already to make that happen. Well, what if I told you that that's actually true of you, that you actually already have everything that you need in order to do what you are supposed to do, and the proof is in the reproductive process. Now, take, for example, the female. The female is born from the beginning with all of the eggs that she would ever need in order to produce life. Okay? All the eggs that she would ever have in her entire lifetime, she already has. Okay? Now, the reason why that's important is because now we accept that she already has everything that pertains to motherhood. Okay? And then on the other side, we have the man who has the capability of creating the reproductive system that is introduced into the female system in order to create life. What I mean by that is he's born with what it takes to make the thing that can make the new life. She's born with the thing to make the new life. Do you see the difference? Now, there's a reason why that's important, because we need to accept that she is born with a spark of life within her, and he is born with the conduit by which the spark of life is made possible. Now, I think it's very important in that process that we begin to understand what is actually occurring at the level of the world of action. Let's talk a minute about the world of action, or the world of Asiya. The world of Asiya, or action, is the world by which all things are moving in a vectored system, where basically something has a magnitude and a direction. A magnitude and a direction that has something to do with our supernatural existence. Now, the best way to put it to you is that there are things that are very, very powerful that are moving around in that space. Well, that space is present right here in front of your face. Now, I understand that that could be a little bit difficult because we always talk about up. But when I talk about up, for example, Moses going up the mountain, he didn't actually descend the mountain and come down the mountain and descend the mountain and come down the mountain 4 times in one day at 80 years old, but instead that he ascended vibrational energy. He ascended frequency. He had an increase in vibration that changed his material expectations that this universe has upon matter, and the energy stayed, and he was able to move to a very different dimension of process by which communication with God was directly possible. Now you say, I don't know about all that, Rabbi, because it talks about them going up the mountain. Well, I will again say that that is nice and pretty and is tied up in a pretty little bow, but you go do it. Let me tell you, I climbed the 5th highest 14,000-foot peak in Colorado, La Plata Peak. In fact, La Plata Peak is actually where the first enthusiast of 14ers died while he was climbing. So it's a very dangerous mountain. And 3 reasons why it is: because there's these huge boulders at the top that you have to climb, and they're wet. They're wet. In the middle of July, they are completely moist because the clouds just dwell there. In fact, there was all kinds of storms. In fact, when we got to the top, there was blizzards. It is climbing from about 10,000 feet to 14,000 feet. So we're ascending about 4,000 feet. And it is expected to be, it is a 9-mile round trip hike. So 4.5 up and 4.5 down. I can tell you that just ascending that much took 12 hours to go up and down. So 6 hours up and 6 hours down. And that's actually not true. It's more like about 8 hours up and 4 hours down, right? But the premise is, I want you to understand the magnitude of what the Bible is claiming that Moses is capable of. Now, we could get into all kinds of things like he was supernaturally enhanced, and so he was able to do the hike at the speed that it would require for him to do that. But in my understanding of what Sinai would have been for them, we're talking about either a much higher mountain or a very different process, and I accept more the very different process. Oh, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason is because now we accept that even though that I say that all these worlds are right here in front of us, they are above in the sense of vibration. In fact, all evolution from the tiniest little thought of a stone or mineral all the way up to the highest and most intelligent being that exists in our reality, which consequently would be us, is just vibration. The amount of vibration that we are at and that we vibrate at. Now, there is all kinds of concepts about disease, dis-ease, like when you are not at ease, your body is not at ease or not fluid, and there are some sort of solids present in your body, that there is actually a change in vibration, and that change in vibration results in more solids, and consequently, that's provable. It's provable that you vibrate at a certain frequency, and when you're not vibrating that frequency, there's usually a solid present in your body, like cancer or kidney stones or blood clots, etc. Okay, and by the way, those are all National Institute of Health papers you can go read about frequency of vibration and solids. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to begin to illustrate what is occurring here in the female, what is occurring in the male. So let's go back to the board and let's talk about this. So first of all, one of the things you need to know is that the Hebrew word for man is ish, spelled like this, and is pronounced ish. Okay? And the Hebrew word for woman is isha. Okay? Isha. Now, when we are working with Hebrew, we can accept that what is the same is balanced, and what is not the same or not symmetrical is imbalanced. Okay? And so, as a result of that, we could go and find that this right here is symmetrical, as is this, right? And if we were to bring these two down together, we then result in what? We result in, let me go ahead and make this in different color. We result in the Hebrew letters Aleph Shin, which consequently is the Hebrew word for fire. Okay? Now, what's left? Well, let's do that in green. Let's do that in green. What's left is the, oops, wrong pen. What's left then is the yod and the hay, and as those are brought down, then we are understanding that that is in itself going to also be a word, which we understand from Psalm 68. Psalm 68, I'll go ahead and navigate there really quick. Psalm 68. Or is it 64? I think it might be 64:8. King James Version. No, it's 68. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be valuable Here we go. Right there. Right there. Sing unto God, sing praises to his name, extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name, Yah. Rejoice before him. And of course, the Hebrew word here is Yah.
Strong's H 3050. Yah. Yah.
Okay. So now we understand that this Yod He is actually a contraction for the word Yahweh. Now, when I recorded my first video that is definitely not in the YouTube archives, it was about this concept that there is a Yod He and there's a Vav He. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Yod He and Vav He to kind of understand it a little better. So let's go to the board and say, okay, so what's missing from our system here, right? Our system of letters here. Oops, did it again. Wrong pen. Here we go. What's missing here? Well, it's the Yod He, right? And so, I'm sorry, the Vav He. And so we'll just kind of put them over here, Vav He. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the tzitzit, okay? We're going to talk a minute about the tzitzit. So the tzitzit are actually designed in such a way that they have some very interesting knots and wraps. Now, I'm not quite sure if these, if my specific ones actually have the correct system in place. It looks like they do. Okay, so the first one has four. I'm sorry. The first one has 5 wraps. Okay, and the second one has 10 wraps, and that is actually the Yod He. 5 and 10 is 15. We'll get to that in a minute. And so the premise is that the Yod and the He have basically then a they have the context or the idea of just the contracted name of Yah. Then the second set of wraps actually has the rest, which would be the Vav He mixed together, which of course the He is 5 and the Vav is 6, and therefore 11 wraps contained as the entire thing. But why is that? Why do we put emphasis on the Yod and the He, but not the Vav and the He? Well, that's the difference between the public and the private ministry. Okay. So what's interesting is there is no Vav He contained within the name, I'm sorry, the title man and woman. There is no Vav He. There's a He, but it's not the Vav He, right? And this would be Ush and Isha, right? That's how that would go. Now, the reason why this is important is because then we understand that it's actually an observable by witnesses and not private operation aspect of Yahweh that is the combination of the man and the woman. So when we talk about copulation, what do we talk about? We talk about there being opposites, an innie and an outie, so to speak, right? A womb to receive and a conduit to transfer seed. That's the principle. And so as a result of that, then we accept that that is not equal, right? But something interesting is occurring when those two entities are horizontal. Whether they be this way or this way, they are actually on an equal plane. So the ish part, or I'm sorry, the aish part, which is the Hebrew word for fire, is actual an equal standing or a balanced standing, and therefore is actually the beauty of that particular act, right? But the part that is actually not equal is the yod and the hay. Now, when we identify the yod and the hay and the sense of the yod and the hay being attributes of the intensification of all power in the universe in some point or way, we remember from previous teachings that the yod ends up being the do, right? And the hay ends up being the observe. And we also, in times past, have talked about the principle of the observe being the context of the placebo effect or the context of the observation issue in the double slit experiment of quantum mechanics. Now, the reason why this is important is because when we accept that the observer has the power to determine the outcome and the doer has the power to do the outcome, then we understand the observer is actually the one that actually has the sovereignty or authority, and the doer is the one who actually has the dunamis or the power. And so now you can understand where we start to get into the premise of the bride losing her dunamis and becoming the vessel of reception, expecting to receive something, observing that reception as what she expected, and the result being something new. Now, we need to talk about that newness for a minute, because is the yod hey new? This is the becoming one, right? Let me illustrate for you a minute what I mean, okay? So what I'm going to do is something really strange, okay? I'm going to say, let me go ahead to the board here. This is going to take a moment to write up here. Therefore, shall a man, oh wait, a man leave his mother and his father and join to his wife and the two will become, become one. Now I'm going to write something different on this side. Here, O Israel. Oh man, did I mess that? Isra, to wrestle. Israel. Lord, or God. The Lord is one. So, what did I do there? This is called something, or this is something called remez, which is basically where you take one verse and you take another verse and you connect them together and you get the complete story. Okay? So the way that I want you to think about this is that this right here is the connection between these two verses. I'm about to prove it to you in the actual Hebrew. So we'll start with Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. There shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. In the Hebrew, the last word is echad.
Strong's H 259. Echad. Echad.
Now, the people who come to test Yeshua say, what is the greatest commandment? Now, in all the synoptic gospels, this story is said to be love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. But Mark, I believe it's in chapter 7, it might be chapter 11, says, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, which is basically this what we call the strong Shema or the greater Shema, which is not the complete Shema, but it is the greater Shema, which is what? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, V'havta et Yahweh Elohecha b'kol levavka uv'kol nafsheka uv'kol me'adecha. It's all one statement. Hear, is the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Okay? So in principle, when we hear the Shema, we're hearing the greatest commandment. Now, that is in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Which again ends in the word echad.
Strong's H 259. Echad.
Okay.
Echad.
So if I had two tablets and the ability to split, well, I do have the ability to split the camera, what am I saying? But if I had two tablets and I could pull both verses up next to each other on those tablets, you would see that both of them end with the word echad. Now, there's something you need to know about that is extremely imperative. Number one, there's no difference between those two verses. A man leaving his mother and father is Yahweh, your Elohim. Okay? Second, it is a commandment to become it. And if it is a commandment to become it, then you have been given instruction. And if you have been given instruction, you are not given instruction as something that you do not have the ability to do. In other words, instruction is actually the truth of the existence of your value and purpose. You're given instruction and enabled because it serves a purpose. Okay? So when we talk about value and purpose, we understand that there's a reason why these instructions are given. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and therefore shall a man leave his mother and father, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, is actually the same commandment. Now, I know that sounds off the wall because you're like, okay, wait a minute now. What are you trying to say here? Are you trying to say that a man leaving his mother and father, being joined to his wife, is actually Yahweh Elohim? Yes. Now, here's how, and here's why. Because when they are joined together, they become the Yod and the Hey. Remember, the Vav and the Hey is reserved for the private interaction between the son, and the Yod and the Hey is the public interaction between the bride. right? Okay, so we have the bride and the bridegroom, Yod Hey, being the contraction of Yahweh. Okay, and then we have the son, which we're going to get into in a minute. The son being a contraction, or the Vav Hey being a contraction of sonship. And now we will explain what a son is. Now, there are two very important elements that you need to understand about nomadic lifestyle. The first is that a nomadic lifestyle is not based upon bloodline per se. And what I mean by that is that if you are nomadic, you have at the core of your priorities hospitality. A man will literally sit outside of his tent, and if he's a clan, then outside of his clan at the gates of the city or gates of the clan, looking for three things: enemies, friends, and strangers. Now, the rule in Hebrew thought is that no one is your enemy unless they declare themselves your enemy through conflict. And what I mean by that is they can talk a whole lot of crap, they can say bad things, and they can still exist as a non-enemy. But when they begin to threaten your well-being, the well-being of your clan, the well-being of your family, the well-being of your property, and specifically your money-making assets, then they are now your enemy, and destruction is permitted. Okay? So the man is sitting at the gates of his city, and he is sitting there, and a passerby approaches the tents, and they are not a known enemy, and they are not a known covenanted friend. The activation of hospitality occurs. Do not pass me by, but turn in, and when you turn in, please be refreshed. Let your feet be washed. Let your and let me tell you, when you're walking around in sandals all day, it's not about the funky thing that Christianity presents about, oh, they're so disgusting, they've got manure and dirt and whatever on their feet. It's about the massage. It's about the reflexology. It's about the comfort and relaxation of your feet being relieved. It was never about the humility of the manure. It was about giving a relief, right, to the passerby. Now, it's important to understand that the foot washing was never about some humiliating thing, but instead hospitality. Now, as we take that into consideration, then we begin to accept and understand that now a stranger is being treated as a clan member. Now, should they choose to dwell with that clan, there is an invitation for them to join the clan in covenant and therefore sit at the table of the king and consume with him in table fellowship. This is called adoption. And it means it doesn't matter whether you were born here or not. If you decide to join us and therefore exchange your weapons with me and become my subordinate, in other words, become one of my military men, then I will preserve you, I will protect you, and I will instruct you. And if you accept those things, then we will be in fellowship, and you can sit at my table and eat with me, right? So what's interesting about this is adoption is about allowing someone into the clan. Okay. So what we accept then is that a son doesn't necessarily mean one who is produced of your loins or of your wife's womb. Okay? It means that they have been accepted into the clan as a son. So somebody can be called a son even if they are not bloodline. There is proof of this in Romans chapter 9, where Paul, as a nomad, expresses this philosophy and says, not all Israel is Israel, right? Who is bloodline Israel, but that only the sons of promise are the sons of God, right? Okay, so the concept is then that we understand that the concept of a son does not necessarily equate to a gender per se, but instead equates to that which is allowed to sit at the table in fellowship, which could include somebody like, say, the daughters of Zelophehad, which are the exception to the rule concerning the masculine preservation of the lineage and legacy. It falls to the firstborn son to preserve the lineage and legacy of the family name. Now, the reason why this is important is for three specific reasons. The first one is that the preservation of the lineage of the name is the result of the fact that a woman will actually no longer be a part of her family, right? She will take upon the name of her husband, and she will raise her children in the name of her husband. Proof in that is in the Levirate marriage, where if a man marries a woman and he goes off to war and dies and she never had any children in his name, her brother is to marry her and have children in that man's name in order to carry forward his legacy to the next generation. Now, two things that are very important. Obviously, the first one is that we don't really see an instance of this working in the Bible. But what we do see is examples of where it was refused, right? But having said that, let's get into the thought process then of a ben or a son, okay, sonship. So sonship is the individual activation of dunamis and exousia, right? Or what we call yachal and mashal. Yachal being the enabling power or energy only to be found in acceptance that there is something other than your own willpower, and there's a necessity for an actual enhancement of the supernatural in your life in order for a miracle to occur. Then we start to accept that there is a premise of a authority or sovereignty granted, and there is a dunamis granted. There's an enabling, there's an ability, right? Okay, so if we go into the Garden of Eden really quick, let's just look at this. Eve has no authority of herself. Now, there's two reasons why I know this is true. The first is that she is actually going to tell the serpent, we shall not eat of it, nor shall we touch it. But did she exist when the original commandment was given? And my question to you is did God repeat it day after day to Adam, or was it repeated to Adam once, and it was an expectation on the part of God concerning Adam, and then when Eve is created, Adam passes down that instruction? Well, the proof is in the fact she says, nor can we touch it, because that was an adaptation of that same system, right? That same system of instruction has an adaptation to it. Lady, don't touch that tree, right? That's the concept there. Don't even touch it. I'll take care of it. I'll cultivate it. Why? Because Adam knew that if he ate from that tree, he would die, but he didn't know what would happen to Eve, right? He was the one who was given the instruction and told and given the consequence and told. So anyways, he tells Eve not to touch it, which is obviously a Pharisaical thought process, right? We'll put a fence around Torah. Anyways, so the concept is that now what happens? She engages with the serpent. Well, recall from my teaching about this before that when she engages with the serpent, she's demonstrating that the serpent is actually an authority. Why? Because it says, God knows in the day that you eat of it, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now he's teaching her, right? He's instructing her. And therefore, she's coming under his covering. She's coming under his authority and sovereignty because he's a teacher and she's a student. He's the greater and she's the lesser. But what was lost in the process? Watch this. Since Adam was the one given the instruction, Adam was the one enabled, she inherits all that is her husband's. According to Torah, if he dies, all property that is his, all authority that is his, goes to her, right? And then later, if the son is of age, then it goes to the son. But the wife is never neglected from the inheritance process. She inherits or receives all of that. And recall from the teaching that I did in 2023 that the inheritance process then means that the power or dunamis and authority, exousia, that exist in a woman are inherited through her father, or if she has stepped into the cleavage with her husband, I'll explain that in a minute, then she actually is inheriting it through her husband. Proof is in the fact that her husband is allowed to annul a contract. Proof in the fact that her father is allowed to annul a contract. And so it's very important for you to understand that if that's true, then now we understand that there is an inheritance of sovereignty or authority to the bride from the groom, right? Okay, that's going to become important here in a minute. So the next thing that we need to then get our minds wrapped around is the concept of what is the result. So it's talking about the result. Let's talk first about the action and reaction. So the action itself is that of the man leaving his mother and father. But now wait a minute. The man leaving his father and mother is actually not what occurs. What occurs is the woman leaves her father and mother and is joined to her husband, and the two become one flesh. So why in the world does this commandment say a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife? Well, what's interesting is while a man is under the roof and or covering of his father and his mother, he has no sovereignty. He has any dunamis that he experiences, any exousia that he experiences is actually a direct instruction from his mother and father. And I'm going to tell you, age 18 back then was meaningless. You could be 30, 40 years old and still be under the provision, protection, instruction of your father and therefore not have your own sovereignty. But once you start to step into the context of therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, something very interesting happens. And this is very powerful, and you need to be very careful with this. That instruction is actually for you to forget the instruction of your mother and father. Forget the protection of your mother and father. To forget the provision of your mother and father. Now this becomes powerful because now we get this idea. Remember I was talking about manuals where somebody says, oh, you know what? I did not, the baby didn't come with an owner's manual. Right? Well, what's interesting is that that's not what Scripture says. Scripture says that we were given everything that pertains to life and godliness. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. And so when we get our minds wrapped around the idea that what we're really leaving is the instruction, I want you to think about what actually your words have been in the past, almost guaranteed. Now, there's a number of people who this may not apply to, but a majority of humanity says, I will not be like my father, or I will not be like my mother. And then we create these compensations. We try to raise our children better than our parents. Why? Because we have not left our father and mother and be joined to our wife and the two become one. We are still listening to the instruction that evidently was not good from our mother and father. What I mean by this is the reason why a man is instructed and given the issuance of sovereignty by Yahweh to him as a solitary entity and no longer under the authority of his father and mother is because of the fact that he himself has to do the exact same thing that every single soul has to do, and that is to free will choose to receive. And free will choose to give, and intriguingly enough, receive to give. Okay? So now we get into something interesting because now we are talking about the idea that the influence of your parents is a bad instruction manual for raising your children. Okay? And it is not how you are supposed to raise your children. You're not supposed to say, oh, you know what? I had to walk to school, so I'm going to drive my kid to school, right? Or, oh, I'm going to give them this because mine never had this when I was a kid. Those are bad instructions. Why? Because the man has been given the sovereignty of God to rule his household. Mashal. We've been given Yachal and Mishal, which is actually what? Dunamis and exousia. Remember, Yeshua ascends from resurrection, stands before his disciples and said, all exousia has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Therefore go ye forth, right? And what? When the woman touches the hem of his garment, the dunamis went out of me. Who touched me? The dunamis went out of me. I felt the dunamis go out of me, right? That's Yakal and Mashal. Now I'm going to show you Mashal in a minute. So the premise is then that a man is supposed to stand on his own 2 feet. So people come to me and they say, well, Rabbi, I was never taught how to be a good father or how to be a good husband. Or a woman will say, I don't know how to be a good mother. Well, that's a lie. And who told you you were naked? Who told you you weren't a good father or a good mother? Somebody's telling you that. And last time I checked, Adam figured out he was naked on his own. Now, what does this mean to humanity? Well, it's interesting because there's kind of a link between this and unleavened bread. So I want you to think about how leavening works, right? It's kind of the sourdough, or it is the fermentation of the dough that actually makes it possible for you to influence other dough to cause it to rise, right? In olden days, they did not have yeast per se in the what is it, Manschwitz? What, I can't remember the name of the company that you get it from, and it's in a little packet and you dump it into your dough. That's not how it works. In the ancient days, you mixed the new dough with the old dough, and the old dough was fermented and therefore would begin the fermentation process of that other dough. In the Feast of Unleavened Bread, preparation for it requires us to get all of that out of our house and begin anew with a new lump, right? Okay, so interesting thing. By Pentecost, you better have actual leavened bread, right? Now, we're in the wilderness, and there really isn't a presentation per se of leavening beyond just sourdough that's being created, which consequently takes about 7 days. And so it makes sense that there was an unleavened bread feast of about 7 days. Now, the next thing that needs to be taken into consideration then is the idea that when a man leaves his mother and father, he is to divest himself of instruction. Now, I know that sounds off the wall, but I want you to think about the contraction and the negation particle and all the things that need to occur in order for the creation to occur, because there's something interesting happening here. So now we need to talk a minute about cleavage stress. So there's a number of different types of stresses, right? So if you pull a rope this way, that's tension, right? If you press something in, that's compression. If you twist something, that's torsion. If you slide something, that's shear. If you pull something apart, that's cleavage. Okay. So cleavage stress is about the separating away or the pulling apart of a set of materials in such a way that glue usually has cleavage stress. So glue holds the two parts together and keeps them from spreading apart, right? And as you're keeping them from spreading apart, that glue is kind of keeping that pressure in such a way that they're not allowed to spread apart. But if they start to spread apart, that's called cleavage. Well, what's interesting is if you go into the Hebrew here, we'll just go back to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, and we'll go into the Hebrew, and we're looking for that word cleave, davak, to cling, stick, stay close, cleave, to keep close, to stick to stick with, to follow closely, to join, to overtake, to catch. Okay. And so when we're talking about davak, we need to go look in the ancient pictographic Hebrew really quick, because we need to kind of see what the original intention of the people who designed the symbols wanted to communicate. Okay. So we'll go into our ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, and then we will go specifically to that Strong's Concordance number. And of course, I have to remove the H real quick here. Because in the New Strong's Concordance, you have H and G numbers, but this is all going to be just Hebrew, so it's the H numbers. All right, davak, here we go. So a couple of things that are important. Number one, it's an adopted root, AR. So it may or it may not have an origin, right? It may or may not have an origin. Let's go look. So this is adopted roots, right? So these are roots that don't have an origin. Now, something interesting, however, is that when we're looking at this, we have the word, we have the dalet bait. Let me go ahead and go back to that search there. There we go. We have the dalet bait, davak. And you'll see right above it, we've got daval, right, which is a cake or pressed figs. And notice there's this idea of joining or sticking together or pressing together, right? Well, if we were to say, go look at the letters dalet bait, which is basically just going to be me going into the keyboard here in the Hebrew and typing in dalet bait. We actually have it here. So if we're looking at dalet bait, we see that the pictograph dalet is the picture of a tent door. The bait is a representation of a tent. Combine these mean the door of the tent. The door of the tent was the place of relaxation for the father, where he would watch his family, and the road for approaching visitors, right? Okay, and getting into that concept, then we need to look at something on the board, okay? So going to the board, let's get a new page and let's talk about this dalet bait, okay? Dalet bait or dav. And we understand that it has to do with watching, right? It has to do with watching. What is that thing? Watch at the tent door. So the way that I want you to think about this is that this is the dalet is in the place of honor, and therefore it's augmenting it. So the door is modifying the tent. Wow, let's talk about that for a minute. There's a lot that actually is going to go into that ramification. The door is actually modifying the tent means what? The tent itself does not contain a door. It contains 4 walls. But the moment one of the walls is split, right, and then is able to move inward or outward, it becomes dynamic. So you have the ability to go into the tent, provision, protection, and instruction, or go out of the tent, nakedness, exposure, and dryness, right? And now all of a sudden there's an option, right? Or a free will. And so interestingly enough, the dalet in front of the bait creates a free will of the tent. But then what's something interesting is that if you reverse the process and we go with bait dalet, we have something very interesting happening because now the tent is modifying the door, which means what? What's in the tent? Provision, protection, instruction is modifying the door from being a wall. And so the tent is saying, wall, you now have the option to have free will. So somebody can go in or they can come out. Teshuvah, moving the shame, bush, right? Remember the press towards the tent versus drawing away from the tent. Okay. So now what we need to do is find out what bait dalet means. So let's go back to our tablet really quick, and we'll just type in the opposite. Bait dalet. Bad. Now we have something very interesting going on. Now it means to separate, right? But listen to the pictographic definition. The pictograph bait is a representation of a tent. The dalet is a picture of a tent door. These 2 pictographs represent the door of the tent. The father of the tent often sat alone at the door where he could receive shade from the sun, watch over the household, and watch the road for approaching strangers. Again, a reference to Genesis 18:1 and 2. So we have something interesting going on. We have 2 separate watches, right? We have a watching from the point of view of the door, right? The door being the precedence or the tent being the precedence. But either way, both of them result in that concept of hospitality. Right? That's important. Hospitality, right? Okay, so the reason why this is important is because what you need to know is that the Hebrew word being used there for daval, which is consequently our word, davak, which is consequently our word for being joined. In fact, let me just go ahead and put a cough here. That's a horrible cough. Okay, and then let me go ahead and put a lamed here. Then we have something interesting going on. And that interesting thing that's going on is that word badal is what? Where is the word badal? Let's take a look here. It's actually going to be in Genesis chapter 2, but it's going to be before all of this. it's going to be in 18. And Yahweh says it's not good for man to be alone. I will make him a help meet, right? For him. What is that Hebrew word alone? Bad. Bad. Alone.
Strong's H 905. Bad,
Bad.
bad.
Bad. Alone is bad, right? Okay. So I'm sorry. I had that lamed on there. Badal is emptiness. So I want you to understand that the concept behind Bad has to do with the emptiness of something, and the concept of Davak has to do with the cleavage that is supposed to occur between the man and the wife. And so the linkage between the two reciprocals of each other actually is the solution to the bad thing. It is not good for man to be alone. The solution was the cleavage, the man being joined to his wife. Well, what's interesting is then it says the two shall become one flesh, but in the Hebrew it says basar echad, right? Basar echad. And so in principle, then what we have is the idea that the man actually becomes a sovereign. Now, the reason why this is important is because then when we get into them two becoming one flesh, we have something interesting happen, and that is going to be in the word son. So we're going to go to first instance of the word son real quick here. Oh yeah, I got to get out of the Hebrew here. There we go. First instance of the word son. Oops, it crashed on me. You know, Blue Letter Bible's been crashing a lot lately. Okay. Oh, it did it again. Now that's interesting. Hold on a second. Let me close this up and just open it back up fresh. Okay. And so the first instance of this word son in the King James is going to be, of course, in Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of the city after his son Enoch, which of course we will know as the word Ben, right? Or son, Ben.
Strong's H 1121. Bane.
Yeah, Ben.
Bane.
Okay, now going down to first instance, it's actually Genesis 3:16, right? Oh, wow, look at that. Unto the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow in thy conception, and in thy sorrow you shall bring forth children, right? But in the Hebrew, it is actually saying, you will bring forth sons, right? Now, recall that a son is just somebody who sits at the table, and a son can potentially be like the daughters of Zelophehad, but of course, they are called a bat, not a bang. But the bang is actually a stewardship, as it were, of what? Of its parents, right? A son is a stewardship of its parents. They have to take care of him, they have to care for him, whatever. And so the son is necessarily in a state of subordination to the authority or exousia of the father or of the mother through, or the father through the mother. Okay? Because, of course, if the father is not present, the authority of the mother is present as an agency of the father's exousia. But the only way that occurs is if she becomes a halala and surrenders that authority in the first place, or surrenders that will, which is obviously this position, Oh yeah, I forgot I made them smaller. This position here, heel, okay, which consequently is the prisoner or the bound one. So we see the right hand moving from the right hand side being bound to the left hand side becoming the keli or the vessel or the willfulness tamed for the yoke, right? And then we see that willfulness transfer into a vav and a hey, which I'm sorry, a lamed and a hey, which consequently is the kalala, right? The kalala is the bride. Now, what's interesting about this is we're going to take this a step further and we're going to say, okay, there is a concept here of offspring being something new and a son being something new and something being subordinate. But what we notice is in that same promise that we're talking about here about increasing your sons, right? It says, and your desire, right? Teshucha will be for your husband. There we go with the word teshucha right here, teshucha.
Strong's HA 669. Teshuka. Teshuka.
Right? But then something interesting happens. He says he shall rule mashal over you, which is what? Exousia. In fact, I believe exousia is going to be in our Septuagint. Oh, wait, I skipped a Septuagint, didn't I? Did I? Oh, duh. Okay, there we go. Let's see here. Tecton pros. Draw. That's not it. Okay, so I don't necessarily see exousia here in this one. But if we go back to exousia, mashal is definitely one of the things. So let's do that. Let's go back to exousia. And of course, to go there, we're actually going to go to, we're going to go back to the Luke verse here. Let's see, Matthew 28. There we go. Luke verse 17, 20. Oh, no, that's not it. That's not the right verse. Come on. We're going to go back to, there it is, the Mark verse. Oh, it is the Matthew verse. Sorry. Yep. Thank you for letting me be valuable in front of you. Here we go. Boom. All right, there we go. Exousia. Boom, right there. And if we go into the Thayers, we will see that the Hebrew word is mashal, right? And I don't know if there's actually an actual listing of the root word mashal, but here we see mashal right there being the word, and of course that is a that's how it's the word exousia is the word for mashal in the Hebrew. So what are we talking about here? Well, a couple things. First of all, is that we made the mistake as translators as translating odd as over you. Let me explain what I mean here. So in Genesis chapter 3 is where Eve receives her instruction concerning what happened after eating the fruit. And specifically what we need to look at is the words in the Hebrew, right, versus what the English says. And so in this case, we have the desire shall be for your husband, but his mashal shall what? Be over thee, No. Let's take a look at what it says in the Hebrew. Oh, look, it's the preposition bait. That means in, and then the kaf, which means you. So his authority will be within you. Well, this is interesting because this is not exactly how the English reads, where it seems as though there's a rulership over the woman. But instead, the authority of the man is through the woman or in the woman. So now the authority of the groom or the bridegroom is in the bride. Oh, this gets deep, right? Because now all of a sudden we accept that the masculine entity is going to grant all power and authority to his bride, right? And we see this present in Proverbs 31, right? In Proverbs 31, she's not just sitting around being a homemaker. She's got businesses and she's a real estate investor and she is a business negotiator, etc., etc. I want you to understand the level of concern I have here for the mistake of saying over you, right? Instead of in you. Okay. Now, we need to look at this word mashal just a little bit more in order to understand the dynamic here. We go to mashal and we looked at first usage, of course, is actually Genesis 1:18, and rule over the day and night and divide the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. Next usage, Genesis 3:16, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth sons, and the desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee, blah, blah, blah. But then we have our next usage as Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted. If thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door unto thee, right? Sin lies at the door unto thee, his desire, and thou shalt what? Rule over him? No. In him. You shall rule in him. Which again, y'all, you're going to have to accept that this is not about over anything. This is about through, okay? And so mastery has to do with going through desire. So why is this all so important? Well, when we start to work with the idea that there's a masculine and feminine principle, there's a binary system of opposites as you were, and when they come together, they become one and become balanced. And the offspring is the result of a new thing as a result of a surrender that occurs in the kalala, right? The kala, right? And the concept or idea of power, right, versus surrender versus humility, all of those things built into the bride, because the groom is going to do what? He is going to assert his exousia, right? Here, let's go ahead and put this on the board. He's going to assert his exousia, right? Here, let's get this just a little bit more centered and a little bit bigger as we can get it. So we'll just center it and make it bigger. Okay, so he's going to assert his exousia and say, I want to what? I want to mashal. I want to rule within you, right? I want you to have my authority, so you need to surrender yours, right? But hers is not necessarily an authority because she receives that same substance from her father, right? And now she's being joined to her husband, losing her name, losing her family, and therefore being adopted into the other family. Who then is the actual binder? It is the husband. He's the one who does the binding. Whoops. Let's go back. Right? He's the one who does the binding. What does he do to the vessel? He fills it. Right? He fills the womb, right? And that then results in a status change whereby she becomes bound to him, right? And we know then that turns into a Torah concept. So, what is the point behind this discussion? Well, first of all, it is important for you to understand that if you are given a commandment, you are given the ability. The ability is not the authority, but the work or energy to get it accomplished. The authority, on the other hand, is actually the agency of God to operate as an agent of that instruction. And then finally, we have the concept that as that occurs, then we understand that that then results in success. So, how does this work? Well, if it says, therefore shall a mother leave, or therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, we need to understand that joining has nothing to do with some public witness of that event, but instead is an understanding that at that moment, as he is coming together with her, he is losing his identity in the sense of a son who has no sovereignty. So until a man actually leaves the instruction, or I'm not going to be like his parents, he's not actually a man and does not actually have sovereignty. So it's important to understand you could be, I don't know, going out and being joined to a woman and thinking that you're sovereign. And in truth be told, as long as you keep telling yourself you're not going to be like them, you're still listening to their instruction. Well, this is important because the new identity is the creator. Right? What's the next thing that happens? They are supposed to be joined together and become one flesh, right? Nobody needs a whole lot of instruction on how this works. We kind of have a really easy map. And we have this weird pheromones and hormones that do all the work for us. And we pretty much figure out how to do it. So there's not a whole lot of information we need there, and everybody knows what it means to be joined to your wife and become one flesh. But what we don't understand is that the cleaving to the wife is the releasing of the wounds, limiting beliefs, entitlements, and authority or agency of the parents. Man, if we could get this down, we would have less damaged children. But there's more to this, because what we need to understand is that word mashal, that is the authority that's supposed to exist within the wife, is the same word mashal of the authority that's supposed to exist within the hunger. Okay? So where you get your brain wrapped around that you are not worthy of anything, and your husband's the boss and he makes all the decisions and he makes the calls and all that, then you have not grasped the level of your potential. And if you walk around dominating your wife and you believe that she has no say, you are limiting your potential. Now, that's usually going to be the result of the instruction from the parents in some way, right? Whether it be guilt or shame, whether it be anxiety, it doesn't matter. But what's important to understand is the same power that gives you the ability to be obedient. Remember that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, ego, but according to the Spirit, dunamis. Then we understand the concept here. The Spirit is potential energy. The Spirit is a thing available to that which would then will itself to be obedient, right? Okay, and so the concept that we need to kind of get our minds wrapped around then is that the same power that gives you the obedience is the same power that gives your wife or spouse or bride the exousia and dunamis, or the agency, the ability to accomplish, right? This is how this works. I mean, and it's kind of a bummer where it's like you wait till your father gets home, but the premise is that the authority of the father is exercised through the mother to the one who would sit at the table, who would then become the legacy of the family. It doesn't have to be bloodline, does it? And so hunger is actually the same dynamic as how a family dynamic is supposed to occur. Well, hunger is not evil. It is not designed to be a vice and a damage by which Yom Kippur activates all kinds of judgments upon you, or worse yet, the wilderness season activates all kinds of judgments upon you. But instead is designed for you to experience the pleasure of satisfaction of receiving, which is the full intent of the intensification of all power in the universe in the first place. When I said we don't have to really do a whole lot. Our pheromones, our hormones, and our plumbing all kind of equate to this is what's supposed to happen. And so in terms of attraction, then we can start to accept that premise that hunger will always attract the satisfaction. Now, what's interesting about that is that if we decide that we ourselves are going to satisfy our hunger, it will always be in excess because we can't determine how much we need. We experience the hunger. I want you to think about this. You come home from work or school, and the first thing that happens is you are hungry and want a snack, right? You're hungry and want a snack, and now you're going to eat. Do you eat just a little bit? Do you moderate your consumption? No. You eat until that mechanism stops poking at you. And then it's time for dinner, and you probably do not consume sufficient for your body, right? You consume according to the level of a lack of desire, or what your mama likes to call ruining your dinner. So the premise is that if we were to actually consume in moderation, we would be permitting the powers, right, to activate within us to not only cause us to be obedient to the commandments concerning gluttony, as it were, but also that we would what? We would consume with a different attitude. So how this is tied in is kind of obscure, but the principle is that the proof that there is actually a satisfaction is in the fact that it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helpmate for him. The reciprocal being, therefore shall a man leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, being the essence of Yahweh, your Elohim, being one, then we start to understand that there is actually a concept of a connection between satisfaction and hunger, resulting in no longer desiring. My question to you is how then are you supposed to continue to appreciate those things which are in existence with you? You see, if you are in a state of ruling over your wife, you already have failed, because you are supposed to fill her with that authority and then give her the sovereignty to activate it. But instead, you are trying to rule the roost, so to speak. The only thing you're doing is creating resentments, and you're going to probably result in some really difficult efforts to maintain the connection, maintain the marriage. But remember, it's the wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements of your mother and father that is actually dictating it and making you rule. So if you think about this, what you really need to do as a husband or as a bridegroom is you need to copy Yeshua and empty yourself into your spouse. Now, what's interesting is that wives are supposed to submit to their husband, right? But what's interesting is what it says about it. It says that you would, without words, rule him. You would win. You would win the arguments. You would win all the stuff if you demonstrate that you have released your exousia and your dunamis and received his and then activate his through the ben, through the children, right? But then they're going to take it a step further and say that the children then receive the authority and power from the parent to then activate within themselves. So if you have a child who's out of control, check it to see whether the mashal and yachal are balanced where they belong, right? If you have a child who is constantly isolating or retracting or contracting their energy, I would propose to you that it might be because you are not correctly pouring into them. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is that when there's an empty vessel, there's desire. When that vessel begins to be filled, there is satisfaction and there's no longer desire. And so therefore, we need to understand that there needs to be a fluctuation, right? There needs to be a fluctuation. Well, you husbands realize that as you fill your wife, you change her status. You rise her up to your equality. Now, Yahweh is going to turn around and reciprocate that and raise you higher, which probably is going to result in a more public ministry, because the Yod and the Hey are public and the Vav and the Hey are private. But what you really need to understand is that public ministry will result because you become what? Sovereign over your household? That's a very inappropriate way to look at it. But you become the dynamic element of your household. Okay? Now, the reason why I say that this is part 3 of In Your Own Light is because what I want you to realize is that all of these masculine and feminine dynamics and sonship and bridehood exist within you because the kingdom of heaven is within you, right? That's in Luke chapter 17, verse 20. Don't look for it here or there because the kingdom of heaven is within you. Now, what's important about that to know then is that all of this rulership and all of this stuff that we're talking about, all this exousia and whatnot, all has to do with you to begin with. You cannot love your spouse without loving yourself first. You cannot love your children without loving yourself first. Love your neighbor as yourself is a model to explain that however much you love yourself is however much you'll love your neighbor. Well, guess what? The heart can't be compartmentalized. If you harden your heart in one area of your life, you've hardened it in all. And if you have a soft heart in one area of your life, you have a soft heart in all. Now, what's important for you to understand is within the context of that thought process, we need to accept that that hardening and softening is not the actual development of a solid versus a liquid versus a gas, but instead has to do with your limiting beliefs, entitlements, and wounds, and lack of authority. Now, here's the more powerful element of this. If a hunger exists, it's an instruction to satisfy it. Now, this can get scary because remember, we've assigned different dynamics to this hunger. We've said, oh, it's for food. And I haven't really brought up what the other ones could possibly be. For example, the hunger for the husband's authority to be granted to you, right? That's an instruction for you to receive from the husband. But what if he doesn't give it? Well, then according to Timothy, you submit, right? Which means what? You elevate the status, and the resulting reciprocation will grant you that authority. Now, what's interesting about that is that within that is elevating the status of the husband who will not bestow upon his family those authorities I'm speaking of. The universe will determine that he doesn't belong in that position and will create a retraction. And that retraction will result in a humbling, and that humbling will result in an understanding or an ability to relate to that person who had the humility to get under him. Now, that can take time, and that actually is painful, and pain is a catalyst for change. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you and help you understand is that if there is a hunger to receive something, most likely it is an instruction to do so. Now, that can get weird because then we need to accept that moderation is the answer to that hunger. And that moderation then results in a satisfaction, and that satisfaction ends up being a lack of desire to, and so there has to be, again, an emptying out, and the dynamic continues over and over and over again. When we are dealing with a husband and a wife, we need to look at the yod and the hey. Together they become Yah. So together they become the Lord your God. But when they are separate from each other, they are willful and pull away from each other, right? They want to be sovereign and do their own thing. The observer doesn't think that a doing is what is necessary, and the doer doesn't think that the observation is necessary. And so the only way is for there to be a coming together. That coming together is the result of hungers, okay? Designed to make you want to be together. Now, that can result in fighting, right? Because your hungers, you become afraid that your hunger is not going to be met, and therefore you want to react to that fear, even though that hasn't happened yet. And that can result in a dynamic of resentment by which eventually this starts to occur. Remember, cleavage has to do with it being stuck together. But as this starts to occur, it's a result of resentment. And remember, if you harden your heart in one place, you'll harden in another. If you have hard hearts towards your parents' instruction, or if you have hard hearts towards, wounds that you have received, or a hard heart that says that you're entitled to something that you're not, or a hard heart that says that you are not able to do the things that you would like to because of this other limitation or because this person did this or whatever, you need to understand that that dynamic is also going to affect the marriage. Now, why is that so important? Because when we look at the end, we look at Revelation, we realize that there is actually a powerful truth present in Scripture. And I say Scripture from the point of view of a Christian understanding of Scripture. In other words, in the 66 book compendium that Martin Luther and a number of other people determined is the only viable Word of God or Scripture, there's a pattern. And it occurs over and over and over again. And that is of marriage, which tells me that the most powerful element of the supernatural is a husband and a wife. Which means what? That means that when we look in the book of Revelation and we see that the marriage supper of the Lamb is the result of a serious purging of the earth, we need to understand the bride's position in that, and we need to understand the husband's position in that, and then we need to understand that that is why your marriage will receive spiritual pushback. The people of power who are above their wounds, limiting beliefs, and a lack of authority or a lack of imagination actually have the premise of being more powerful as one entity than as two separate. In other words, the sum of the whole is more powerful than the individual parts. So we could talk about the dynamic of a father and a son and how powerful that is, but truth be told, the more powerful of the two is going to be the end game. And the end game is a marriage. And so you need to understand that the purpose behind the coming together is A, you will leave the provision, protection, and instruction of the father and mother. B, you will be joined. That excludes covenant, marriage licenses, etc., etc. However, in that moment, when that man makes that decision to do that thing, he needs to understand that that is that decision to operate within that magnitude. But that means he can't have his parents in his brain, whether it be a bitterness or whether it be an inspiration, as the instruction, because he already has the identity as a result of the fact that he already has the what? He already has the instruction, which means it's actually his purpose to be a father and to be a husband. And if that's the case, then there is no instruction manual required. Just like we can very easily look at the instruction about that which has been made. We have parts, we have pheromones, and we have hormones at what tells us to be together, right? No problem there. We don't need a whole lot of instruction. Same is true of fatherhood. Same is true of husbandhood. Same is true of the bride. Same is true of the mother. And so what's interesting is that even though you think you don't have the instruction, you actually do, because you were given the purpose. And even though that you have, or even though you don't think that you have the ability, you actually do, because you were given the instruction. And so what's interesting about it is all the things that are required for you to do and carry this out exist that way. Well, now let's look back to purpose really quick, okay? Purpose is a hunger. What do I mean by that? We all want to know our purpose. We long to know it. It's a building over time, and it becomes more obsessive over time. What is my purpose? Why am I here? Well, truth be told, There is a satisfaction to that hunger. But it's going to require you to let the intensification of all power in the universe enable you, just like he has enabled you to do covenant, enabled you to be a husband or to be a wife. He has enabled you to have purpose. I will remind you that your adversity will become your strength. Your strength will become your expertise, and your expertise becomes your purpose. So if you want to know your purpose, all you need to do is look at where things are hard in your life, what you've had to overcome since you were, a little kid. And you will realize where you're supposed to work and what you're supposed to do. And when I say supposed to, I want you to understand it's still free will. And when I say supposed to, I'm not sitting there saying that the universe breaks if you don't. Because God is able to raise these rocks up to sing praise, right? So I guess the biggest thing I'm trying to help you understand with this is that when you are given an instruction, you already have everything you need to obey it. You have the power, the authority, you have the insight, the wisdom, you have the knowledge. All of that is contained within the instruction itself. So your very existence as a man and your hormones that drive you towards the preservation of the species, like an animal, actually are the proof of the instruction that you are supposed to be a father. You are supposed to be a husband. If you're a woman and you have arrived at a position where you doubt your ability to be a mother, you are a fool because you have been given everything that pertains to it. In fact, you actually have better instruction than the man does, where he doesn't really have the connection between the context of being able to make life. He kind of has to produce it over time. You already have it. You already have the light. You are the light. And therefore, it's important for you to understand that as a mother, you will be a good mother because you were instructed to be. And the only thing that keeps you from that is the limitation of your parents and also the wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements that you need to kind of flush out of your life because those are not your identity. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. That is your identity, an equal distributor of the light. And if you're an equal distributor of the light, then you understand the dynamics of how the light is supposed to be distributed, which means what? You're enabled in that area to do that thing. So as a woman, you have been given instruction by being born that you are supposed to what? Become a mother and become a wife. Now, does that mean that you will choose to sometime in this lifetime? No. You may have a lifestyle choice that does not contain those elements. But believe you me, the instruction is still present and the enabling is still present. So if there's ever a time where you decide to obey that instruction, you're enabled. It's not like, these years down the road, all of a sudden you change your mind and you want to obey this instruction, that something is going to prevent that. That's not true. You have everything. And so it's important for you to understand that the purpose behind this is to be a creator, which means it is proof of you being able to exercise your dunamis, your energy. And if you think about it, this is the only time within human beings when there actually is an activation of the divine, because we don't go walk around and take dirt and make it and blow on it, and next thing you know, there's something existing there. We go through a very different process, don't we? A very intense process, right? So when you are waiting for this to occur, you need to understand you've been given that instruction, and therefore if you've been given that instruction, then that means that it will be provided to you It's important for you to understand all the dynamics of what you are supposed to do in your gender, how you're supposed to work within your gender. And again, this is not about lifestyle choice. That's your free will stuff. I don't mess with that. But I can tell you how you were born, and I can tell you how your body works, and I can tell you that that is an exact facsimile of what happened in the heavens. And if that's what happened in the heavens, and that's the end game in the book of Revelation, then we should probably get our mind wrapped around that that's how that's supposed to occur. And if that's true, then we're being obedient to an instruction. If we're obedient to an instruction, then it's demonstrated that we are valuable because we've been given purpose, but also that we have been enabled and that we have been given the authority, right? Okay, fair enough. Enough said on that. I think it's important to really understand that that is a dynamic of the wilderness season, because the satisfaction of the desire has the same elements within it as the satisfaction or the desire that is occurring within the marriage covenant or the marriage joining. And then we need to understand that that all has to do with the idea that there is always an answer to the emptiness. And there is always a way in which this is supposed to play out. But I promise you, one of the things that you need to divest today is your parents' authority. If you were married, your parents' authority and their power. You need to divest yourself of that. You need to become your own vessel or your own status as greater or your own status as lesser. And you need to step into those roles in those ways in order to continue to complete the supernatural dynamic. Because there's something powerful about couples. There's something powerful about connection. And there's something powerful about some sort of war that is actually being fought in the number 2. Okay? So be aware that that means that there will be friction or resistance.